Ethan Miller realized he had made a mistake about half a second too late. He was standing in his small kitchen, one hand wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the other holding his phone. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft rain tapping against the window. Emma, his 8-year-old daughter, was already asleep in the next room, her nightlight casting a gentle glow under the door. Ethan exhaled, exhausted. It had been one of those days, the kind that left him mentally drained and emotionally worn thin. Deadlines at work, a forgotten permission slip for school, another reminder that life hadn't slowed down just because his wife was gone. Without really thinking, he typed a message meant for his best friend. "My boss is dangerously attractive. It's honestly distracting." He hit send. Then his stomach dropped. The name at the top of the screen wasn't Mike. It was Claire Whitmore. His boss, the CEO? Ethan's heart started pounding, sharp and frantic. His thumb hovered over the phone as if he could somehow pull the words back through the screen. He reread the message, hoping, stupidly, that it might change. It didn't. A wave of panic rushed through him. His thoughts spiraled immediately to the worst-case scenario. Getting fired, losing his job, losing the steady income that kept a roof over Emma's head and food on the table. He rubbed a hand over his face, dragging his fingers through his hair. "You idiot," he muttered under his breath. Claire Whitmore wasn't just his boss. She was the new CEO, sharp, composed, intimidating in a way that made the entire office walk a little straighter. She had taken over the company 6 months ago, and people were still trying to figure her out. Some admired her, others were waiting for her to fail, and now Ethan had just handed her the most unprofessional text imaginable. His phone buzzed. One new message. Ethan swallowed hard and opened it. "My office, tomorrow, 8 a.m. That was it, no punctuation, no explanation. He lowered himself into a chair, his chest tight. Tomorrow morning suddenly felt like an execution date. A few minutes later, he stood and walked quietly to Emma's room. She was curled on her side, her stuffed bear tucked under her arm, her face peaceful in sleep. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his expression softening. "No matter what happens," he whispered more to himself than to her, "I've got you." As he turned off the light and closed the door, one thought echoed in his mind. One careless text might have just changed everything. Ethan barely slept that night. He lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around him. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt louder than usual. His mind kept replaying the message. The words burned into his memory like a warning sign he'd ignored. By 6 a.m., he gave up on sleep. He moved quietly through the kitchen, packing Emma's lunch the way he always did. Apple slices, a peanut butter sandwich, a handwritten note tucked inside. It was a small ritual, one of the few things he could control. Being a single father had taught him that routines were lifelines. Emma shuffled in, still half asleep, her hair sticking out in every direction. "Morning, kiddo," Ethan said, forcing a smile. She climbed onto a stool. "You look tired." "Just a long day yesterday," he replied, ruffling her hair. "Big meeting today." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood more than he expected. Since her mother died 3 years ago, Emma had learned to read the room, to sense when her dad was holding things together with effort, alone. Ethan drove her to school in silence, the radio playing softly. When he hugged her goodbye, he held on a second longer than usual. "Love you," she said. "Always," he answered. At work, Ethan was known as reliable. Creative. Quiet. He showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. He didn't have the luxury of taking risks, not when someone else depended on him. Claire Whitmore's arrival as CEO had changed the company overnight. She was efficient, sharp-minded, and intimidating in a polished, unapproachable way. Ethan had admired her from a distance, the way one admires a storm from behind glass. Now that distance was gone. As the elevator carried him upward toward the executive floor, Ethan's chest tightened. Whatever happened next wouldn't just affect him. It would affect Emma. And for the first time since his wife passed, Ethan felt truly afraid. Not of being alone, but of failing the one person who needed him most. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Ethan stepped onto the executive floor. Everything up here felt different. Quieter, cleaner, more deliberate. The carpet muted his footsteps as he walked past glass offices and framed awards lining the walls. He checked his watch again. 7:59 a.m. Right on time. Claire Whitmore's assistant gave him a brief nod. She's ready for you. Ethan swallowed and pushed open the door. Claire stood by the window, her back to him, city lights spilling across the room. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her posture straight, composed, unreadable. When she turned, her expression was calm, almost neutral, but her eyes were sharp, observant. "Good morning, Ethan," she said evenly. "Have a seat." He did, his hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. "I want to address last night's message," he began quickly, the words tumbling out. "It was a mistake, completely unprofessional. I wasn't thinking, and I'm deeply sorry. It won't happen again." Claire studied him for a long moment. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Then she reached for a folder on her desk and slid it toward him. "I'm not here to fire you," she said. Ethan blinked. "You're not?" "No," she replied. "You're one of our strongest creatives. Reliable, thoughtful, consistent." She paused. "One careless text doesn't erase years of good work." Relief hit him so fast he had to steady himself against the chair. "But," she continued, her tone firm, "professional boundaries matter, especially in this office." "Yes, absolutely," Ethan said. "I understand." Claire leaned back slightly, her gaze softening just a fraction. "There's a client presentation coming up. The Atlas campaign. I want you to lead it." His heart skipped. "Me? I need fresh thinking," she said. "And I need people I can trust." Trust. The word lingered between them. As Ethan stood to leave, Claire added, almost casually, "Don't make me regret this decision." "I won't," he said, meaning it with everything he had. When he stepped back into the hallway, his legs felt weak, not from fear this time, but from something far more unsettling. Because for the first time since the message was sent, Ethan realized this wasn't just about a mistake anymore. Something had shifted, and he had no idea where it would lead. By the end of the day, Ethan's desk was covered in notes, printouts, scribbled ideas, half-empty coffee cups lined up like quiet witnesses to his focus. The Atlas campaign had consumed him completely, not just because it was a major opportunity, but because it felt like a test, not only of his talent, but of the trust Claire had placed in him. Across the office, the energy felt tense. Since Claire Whitmore had taken over as CEO, the company had changed fast. Meetings ran tighter, expectations were higher, and not everyone was comfortable with that. Ethan had overheard enough hushed conversations in break rooms to know some people were waiting for her to stumble, especially Marcus Hale. Marcus was a senior board member, older, polished, and dangerously confident. He had a way of smiling without warmth, of speaking as if he already knew the outcome. Ethan had seen him in meetings, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Claire like she was a problem he intended to solve. Late that afternoon, Ethan passed the conference room and caught a glimpse inside. Claire stood at the head of the table, explaining quarterly projections with controlled precision. Marcus interrupted her mid-sentence, his tone calm but dismissive. "That's ambitious," he said, "risky." Claire didn't flinch. "Growth always is." Their eyes locked for a brief second. The air felt tight, charged. Ethan walked on, something unsettled stirring in his chest. For the first time, he realized Claire wasn't just managing a company. She was constantly defending her right to lead it. That night, long after most of the office had emptied, Ethan was still working when his phone buzzed. A message. "How's Atlas coming along?" to Claire. He stared at the screen, surprised. "Making good progress." "Still refining the core concept," he replied. A few seconds passed. "Don't push yourself too hard," she wrote back. "I need you sharp, not exhausted." Ethan leaned back in his chair, reading the message again. It was professional, polite, and yet something about it lingered. As he shut down his computer and headed home, one thought stayed with him. Claire Whitmore carried far more than her title suggested. And somehow, without meaning to, Ethan was starting to carry some of it with her. The call came just after lunch. Ethan was reviewing design mock-ups when his phone vibrated against the desk. He almost ignored it until he saw the number. Riverside Elementary. His chest tightened as he answered. "Mr. Miller?" the woman on the line said gently. "This is Ms. Carter, Emma's teacher." Ethan straightened in his chair. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause. "She's safe," Ms. Carter assured him. "But we've noticed she's been struggling lately. She's had a few emotional outbursts, and today she got into an argument with another student." Ethan closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "She's been having a hard time." "We understand," the teacher replied. "The anniversary of her mother's passing is coming up, isn't it?" Yes, Ethan said, his voice rough. Next week. She's a bright, sensitive child, Miss Carter continued. But she's carrying more than an 8-year-old should. She may need extra support, consistency, reassurance, maybe even another adult presence she can trust. After the call ended, Ethan sat there for a long moment, staring at nothing. He told himself he was doing enough, that love and hard work would cover the gaps. But moments like this made the cracks impossible to ignore. That evening, as he tucked Emma into bed, she clutched her blanket tightly. "Did I do something bad today?" she asked softly. "No," Ethan said immediately, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You didn't do anything bad." She hesitated. I miss Mom." The words landed heavy. "I know," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I miss her too." After she fell asleep, Ethan sat alone in the quiet living room, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He thought about work, about Claire, about the impossible balance he was trying to keep. For the first time, he wondered if strength alone was enough. And somewhere deep down, a question formed, one he wasn't ready to answer yet. What if doing everything alone wasn't the same as doing everything right? The Atlas presentation was a success, at least on paper. The clients nodded. The numbers made sense. The room buzzed with cautious optimism. But Ethan barely noticed the praise. His attention kept drifting to the far end of the conference table, where Claire sat upright, composed, her expression carefully neutral. When Marcus Hale spoke, the temperature in the room shifted. "This approach feels ambitious," he said, folding his hands. "Possibly too ambitious." Claire didn't hesitate. "That's exactly why they came to us. Atlas doesn't need safe. They need relevant." Marcus's smile was thin. "Risk has consequences." "So does stagnation," she replied calmly. The client cleared his throat. "Actually," he said, "this is exactly what we were hoping for." The tension broke. Relief washed across the table. Marcus leaned back, his jaw tightening, while Claire allowed herself the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Later, as the room emptied, Ethan packed his laptop, heart still racing. Claire caught his eye from across the room. "Walk with me," she said quietly. They moved down the hallway together, side by side, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "You did well today," Claire said. "You held your ground." "Thank you," Ethan replied. "You did too." She stopped near the window overlooking the street below. "Marcus will push back harder now." "I noticed," Ethan said. "He doesn't like losing." "No," she agreed. "He doesn't like not being in control." Claire turned to face him, her expression thoughtful, less guarded than usual. "I shouldn't ask this, but are you holding up?" The question caught him off guard. "My daughter's struggling," he admitted. "I'm trying to be enough for her." Claire nodded slowly. "You are." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said it, quietly, carefully. "We should probably celebrate the win. Dinner." Ethan's stomach tightened. He thought of Emma, of Marcus, of the line they were standing on. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said honestly. Claire studied him, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "Understood," she said, her tone professional once more. As she walked away, Ethan exhaled. He'd done the responsible thing. Yet the uneasy feeling in his chest told him the line between responsibility and regret was already beginning to blur. Ethan told himself it was harmless. That was the thought he held on to as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel, guiding the car into the parking lot of a small neighborhood restaurant just off Main Street. It wasn't flashy or formal, wooden booths, soft lighting, the kind of place where families felt welcome. Emma sat in the back seat, swinging her legs. "So, this is your boss?" "Yes," Ethan said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "And remember your manners." "I always have manners," she replied, offended. Claire was already waiting outside when they arrived. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair down, looking far less like a CEO and far more like a regular woman. Ethan felt a strange sense of relief at the sight. "Hi, Emma," Claire said warmly as they approached. "I'm Claire." Emma studied her carefully. "You don't look scary." Claire laughed, genuine and unguarded. "I'll take that as a compliment." Inside, conversation flowed more easily than Ethan had expected. Claire asked Emma about school, her favorite subjects, the books she liked to read. She listened, really listened, in a way that surprised him. "You work too much," Emma announced between bites of fries. Ethan winced. "Emma, she's not wrong," Claire said with a smile. "I probably do too." Emma tilted her head. "Do you have kids?" The question landed softly but firmly. "No," Claire said after a brief pause. "I never found the right time. Or the right person," Emma added innocently. Claire's expression shifted, vulnerable, almost exposed. Something like that. By the time dessert arrived, Ethan realized something had changed. This wasn't a risky dinner or a blurred boundary. It was two tired adults sharing a moment of normalcy. As they walked back to the car, Emma skipped ahead. "Thank you for tonight," Ethan said quietly. Claire nodded. "Thank you for trusting me." Their eyes met, the space between them charged with words left unsaid. And as Ethan drove home, he knew, whatever this was, it was no longer just dinner. The office felt different the next morning. Not louder, not quieter, just watchful. Ethan sensed it the moment he stepped inside. Conversations dropped when he passed. A few coworkers glanced up, then quickly looked away. He told himself it was his imagination, but the uneasy tightness in his chest said otherwise. Across the open floor, Marcus Hale stood near the glass conference room, speaking to two board members. He laughed softly, his hand resting casually on the back of a chair. When his eyes met Ethan's, the smile didn't fade. It sharpened. Later that day, Ethan ran into Marcus at the coffee station. "Big night?" Marcus asked lightly, stirring his drink. Ethan froze. "Excuse me?" "Dinner," Marcus continued, voice smooth. "You, Claire, and the kid. Cozy." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "It wasn't inappropriate." Marcus chuckled. "I didn't say it was." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "But perception matters, especially when a young CEO is still proving she belongs." The words lingered long after Marcus walked away. That afternoon, Claire called an unexpected meeting. Her tone was calm, professional, but Ethan noticed the tension beneath it. As she spoke, her gaze flicked briefly toward Marcus, then away. After the meeting, Ethan waited until the hallway cleared. "Is everything okay?" he asked quietly. Claire hesitated. "Marcus has concerns." "About last night?" She didn't answer immediately. That told him enough. "I never wanted to make things harder for you," Ethan said. "I know," she replied, "but some people are always looking for leverage." That evening, as Ethan tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him sleepily. "Did I do something wrong at dinner?" His heart clenched. "No, sweetheart, you were perfect." After she fell asleep, Ethan sat alone on the couch, the house wrapped in silence. He thought about Marcus's smile, about Claire's careful distance, about the fragile balance he'd stepped into without realizing it. For the first time, Ethan understood the real risk. This wasn't just about feelings anymore. It was about consequences, and someone was already waiting to use them. The call came just before noon. Ethan was mid-sentence on a conference call when his phone lit up again and again on the desk. He tried to ignore it until he saw the name. Riverside Elementary. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, muting his headset. "I need to take this." His pulse raced as he answered. "This is Ethan Miller." "Mr. Miller, this is the school nurse," the woman said calmly. "Emma had a fall on the playground. She's okay, but we think you should come get her." Ethan was already grabbing his jacket. "I'm on my way." He barely remembered the drive. By the time he reached the school, Emma was sitting on a bench, her wrist wrapped, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I didn't cry," she said quickly, as if defending herself. "I know," Ethan replied, kneeling in front of her. "You're very brave." The doctor confirmed it was only a mild sprain. Still, the image of her small arm in a sling stayed with him as they returned home. That evening, as Ethan helped Emma settle on the couch, the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Claire standing there, holding a small gift bag, her expression uncertain in a way he'd never seen before. "I hope this isn't crossing a line," she said softly. "I heard about Emma." Ethan hesitated just for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Emma's face lit up when she saw Claire. "You came!" Claire smiled, kneeling to her level. "I brought something to keep you busy." They spent the afternoon making friendship bracelets on the living room floor. Claire laughed easily, her sleeves rolled up, fully present. For the first time, she wasn't a CEO. She was just human. Later, as Emma napped, Claire stood near the doorway, gathering her things. "Marcus knows," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I figured." "This could get messy," Claire added. Ethan met her eyes, his voice steady. "Then we deal with it." As she left, the weight of what was coming settled heavily in the room. Because whatever Marcus planned next, there would be no way to avoid it. The board meeting was called for 8 a.m. sharp. No agenda, no explanation. That alone was enough to make the entire office uneasy. Ethan arrived early, his stomach tight as he took a seat near the back of the conference room. One by one, board members filed in, their expressions guarded, voices low. At the front of the room, Marcus Hale stood confidently, hands clasped behind his back, looking entirely at ease. Claire entered last. She wore a dark blazer, her posture straight, her face composed, but Ethan could see the tension beneath the surface. She met his eyes briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, then took her seat at the head of the table. Marcus didn't waste time. The board has serious concerns, he began smoothly. Concerns about leadership judgment, professional boundaries, and decisions that put this company at risk. The air in the room thickened. Claire folded her hands. I'd like to hear specifics. Marcus smiled. Risky client strategies, questionable personnel favoritism. He paused, letting the words settle. And inappropriate personal involvement with subordinates. Several heads turned toward Ethan. His heart pounded, but he stayed still. Claire's voice remained calm. If you're referring to dinner with Mr. Miller and his daughter, that was a professional courtesy following a successful campaign. And the visit to his home, Marcus pressed? Before Claire could respond, Ethan stood. Yes, he said clearly. She came to check on my injured 8-year-old. If that's misconduct, then I think we've lost perspective. Marcus scoffed. You're not a board member, Mr. Miller. No, Ethan agreed. But I am someone who cares about this company. He reached into his bag and placed a folder on the table. These are internal emails, Ethan continued, between you and competitors, information leaks, attempts to undermine client trust. The room erupted in murmurs. Marcus's face darkened. This is absurd. Is it? Claire asked quietly. The silence that followed was heavy and final. As board members flipped through the documents, Ethan felt the weight of his decisions settle in. He had crossed a line, but for the first time he knew. Some lines were worth crossing. The room felt different once the meeting ended. Not louder, not calmer, just emptied, like something heavy had finally been lifted, leaving silence in its place. Marcus Hale was escorted out without another word. His confident posture collapsed somewhere between the door and the hallway. The board members avoided eye contact as they gathered their things, murmuring apologies and congratulations in equal measure. Claire remained seated. Ethan hesitated before approaching her. The adrenaline that had carried him through the meeting was fading fast, replaced by a quiet, trembling exhaustion. I hope I didn't make things worse, he said softly. Claire looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, the polished distance was gone. What remained was relief, raw and unmistakable. You didn't, she said. You saved this company, and you saved me. He exhaled, a breath he felt like he'd been holding for weeks. They walked out together, side by side, the office buzzing behind them but strangely distant now. You didn't have to risk your job, Claire said as they reached the elevator. You have a daughter, a life that depends on you. Ethan nodded. That's exactly why I did it. She turned to face him fully. Why? Because Emma deserves to grow up seeing what it looks like when someone stands up for what's right, he said. Then quieter. And because I couldn't watch someone tear you down for doing your job well. The elevator doors opened, but neither of them moved. I care about you, Claire admitted, more than I should. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle into something steady, something honest. Me too. This time there was no interruption, no watchful eyes, no power imbalance hanging between them. Just two people, exhausted and exposed, standing in the aftermath of a storm they had survived together. As the doors finally closed, one truth was clear to both of them. The hardest part was over. What came next would be a choice. 3 months later, life had settled into something new. Not perfect, not effortless, but real. Ethan stood in his kitchen one quiet evening, chopping vegetables while Emma worked on her homework at the table. The house felt warm, lived in. The kind of warmth that didn't come from decor or furniture, but from shared routines and small moments that added up. Claire arrived just after 6, slipping off her shoes by the door like she belonged there. And in many ways she did. Their relationship hadn't been rushed. It had been disclosed, discussed, questioned, and chosen. Claire remained CEO. Ethan remained focused on his work and his daughter. Boundaries existed, but so did trust. Emma looked up from her homework. You're late. Claire smiled apologetically. Board meeting ran long. Emma nodded, accepting the explanation like it made complete sense. Then she paused. Can you help me with science later? Of course, Claire said gently. If that's okay with your dad. Ethan watched the exchange, something tight in his chest loosening. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, Ethan and Claire sat on the back porch, wrapped in quiet. The stars were faint, the air cool. I used to think my life was over when my wife died, Ethan said softly. I thought love was something I'd already had my chance at. Claire listened, her hand resting lightly over his. I never thought I'd have a family, she admitted. Not really, I thought my work would have to be enough. They sat with that truth between them. A week later, Ethan proposed. Not with grand gestures, but with steady certainty. He didn't promise perfection. He promised presence, honesty, choice. Claire said yes without hesitation. When they told Emma, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, does this mean you're trying to replace my mom? Claire knelt in front of her, voice calm, sincere. No, your mom will always be your mom. Nothing could ever change that. Emma thought about it. Then she nodded. Okay, I think she'd like you. That was enough. 1 year later, the three of them stood together in their backyard, laughter drifting through the evening air. It hadn't started with romance or hope, but with a mistake. And sometimes that's how life works. So here's the question for you. Do you believe people deserve a second chance at love? Have you ever made a mistake that ended up changing your life for the better? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story moved you, reminded you of someone you love, or gave you a little hope tonight, please subscribe to the channel for more real human stories about love, family, and the moments that change us when we least expect it. Because sometimes the wrong message sent to the wrong person turns out to be exactly what we needed.